morning. Has everybody had their coffee? I hope you've enjoyed breakfast and coffee, and I'm very happy to see so many people here to get started with our program this morning. My name is Karyn Jacobs, and I'm the director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, or OLLI, as we like to call it, here at Sonoma State University. And I'm very happy to see so many familiar faces and some new faces with us here today. I hope you enjoyed your breakfast, as I said, and have left a little bit of room to savor the sampler platter that lies ahead of you with all that we have to offer this spring. We officially changed seasons to spring last week with the equinox and the advent of Sonoma County allergies, which I never had, but was always told that if I lived here long enough, I would come to understand, and I think that has finally come to pass. So before we begin, I always like to ask how many of you here were with us, as we say, at the beginning? That was 2001. Keep your hands up. I see about 6 or 8 of you. Wonderful. And how many of you were here 10 years ago with us? Most of the room. Fantastic. And just as importantly, how many are here with us for the first time today? Wonderful. Welcome. Welcome to OLLI. We're very glad to have so many new faces. For your benefit in particular, we are one of 122 Osher Institutes around the country, all on college and university campuses, and we were the second in that network to be established. And we've always been very proud of that, but we're particularly proud of that as we come up on our 20th year next year. So we are planning a lot of celebratory activities, and we'll keep you posted on the ways that we intend to mark that meaningful anniversary. We are grateful, as always, for the support of the Bernard Osher Foundation, who helped us start this program back in 2001, and for the support of our OLLI staff, Chris Alexander and Chris Rogers. I could not do this without them. And for our many volunteers who are in the room. Those of you who are ambassadors, on the advisory board, on the curriculum committee, on the outreach committee, would you please raise your hands? Thank you very much for all that you do. You might notice there's a page in the spring catalog recognizing all of you, and I want to do that publicly and more often. So thank you for all that you do for the program. For today, each of our instructors has 5 minutes, 5 minutes, to share their course with you and entice you to spend 6 weeks of your life with them this spring. But for those who need help counting to 5, I might offer gentle reminders by tap dancing or juggling on the side of the stage, which, believe me, you don't want to see. In addition to our regular curriculum, I do want to mention that we're very pleased to present our annual Ed Stolman Memorial Lecture, named after the founder of this program. This year, we're delighted to feature in that lecture local historian Gay LeBaron, who many of you know. I invite all of you to join us for that event next week, April 3rd, as Gay talks a lot about Santa Rosa history, and in particular shares her recent book on the history of Fountain Grove, and there will be a book signing following her lecture. This is a free event in Schroeder Hall at the beautiful Green Music Center on the other side of campus. Please note there are no advance tickets necessary, but please come early to assure that you get a seat. There are flyers in the lobby if you want more information. But I do hope you'll join us. I think it's going to be a fantastic program. I also invite all of you to attend our second course preview this week at the Glazer Center satellite campus of ours in downtown Santa Rosa. That will take place on Wednesday morning, and instructors who are scheduled to teach at that campus will be presenting their courses And yes, there will be more free food. So I hope to see you again on Wednesday. So without any further ado, let's get to our main event here. I'm pleased to report that for the first time in a while, all 9 of our instructors are here in the flesh today, in 3 dimensions. So the videos are nice, they're better than nothing, but to have everybody here in person to talk to you is really the ideal situation. So I'm glad you all were available. Thank you. So let's start with someone who is no stranger to OLLI. He has taught for us for many years, and I keep challenging him to develop new courses, which he does ably and nimbly. And this one, I think, will resonate with many of you. On the Western epics, please join me in welcoming Douglas Kenning.
Thank you, Karyn. The Western epics, the 4 great stories of our civilization, beginning with Gilgamesh, which is the first story of Western civilization, from the first civilization, a place where men were men, except when they were animals, where men throw shit in the face of gods, where men engage in the civilization-defining job of plundering the resources of our planet. For example, timber, though that too was guarded by the gods of the forest, where you might reasonably find a reasonable scorpion man and encounter a world-erasing flood and face the question of whether you actually can be born again. Sing muse of rage. In our next epic, it is not a hero's journey, as Gilgamesh was, but a journey of heroes. A story of man driven to war by an obsession with women, which is, of course, operatic. And here, too, the axe is wielded by a man, but motivated by a goddess. For although men occupy the gaze, our gaze at center stage, they are flanked either side by controlling goddesses, as men ever are by women, as men who are always used as pawns by women. And sexual politics also is operatic. Still, whoever is directing the show, the men tend to be the central actors in epics. By actor, that, by the way, is not Achilles, it's Brad Pitt. That is Achilles. And also real is the trauma that epics tell us about. They teach us about trauma and also teach us how to grieve, which we have forgotten. But war is and was always about women, and tragedy has its eternal companion, love, which, of course, is poetic. Sing muse of a man of many turnings. The previous story was a tale of men doing what they love best, fighting about women. This story is enacted on a field of women with rules written by women and whose judges are women, as the life of a man is defined by women, especially one who he holds very special. No, not his mom, but not a goddess, but his wife, a mortal. The one special one will make him earn his return to her. In all that struggle, all that deadly adventure on the high seas, that whole story is brought to stillness in the bed of his wife, who will there find his true nature. But that's not the only story of the Odyssey. It is even more about a young boy who cannot learn how to cross the bridge into manhood with only women telling him he has to also have his father return home. He must reconnect with his father. There are some things besides the opposite sex that bring trauma to be true. Here's a story also of a returning veteran who's faced with hostility at home. Sing muse of arms and the man. How influential was Homer? The entire multicultural, multi-ethnic Roman Empire found its central story in a Greek story. A shameless imitation of Homer, of men, high adventure on the high seas. But now it's a whole people on the move. It's migration in the Mediterranean. There's an old and continuing story, people migrating the Mediterranean, fleeing from war. But it's just an old story of love, equally old, of love and betrayal, which, of course, is operatic. And a motivator for great art. And again, the women remain wiser than the men. And again, it's the women who know the way to the underworld, even to help a man find his father. And so, too, it is, yes, also another quest. And it involves, of course, as men always must contest against each other, even if it's about women. Because ancient Rome was not built by stone alone, but by story. And Rome is the model for us. And so are these stories our stories, the Western epics. Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to someone who I like to say has them dancing in the aisles from minute one. Those of you who've taken classes from him know what I mean. And every time I think he's exhausted his canon, he comes up with something new. And I think this is going to be a lot of fun. How many of you have taken a class with Pete Elman? How many of you like Motown? Okay. Without any further ado, someone who's become a true OLLI favorite, Pete Elman.
All right, good morning, everybody. Had to brave the traffic to get up here from the Bay Area. And I just flew back from Texas, but I'm here, and I'm very glad to be here. This will be the 6th course I've taught for OLLI Sonoma. I now have 12 different courses on American popular music of the, last half of the 20th century, and this one is very special, dear to my heart, and I'm sure close to many of y'all's hearts. How the sound of young America, Motown, took the music world by storm and never looked back. This class is about a unique, special, magical period in time and history, a cultural watershed, where the vision of one man, Berry Gordy, was able to create this incredible, unique, independent record company which took the music business literally by storm and proved that somebody's vision and passion and hard work could achieve amazing things. But of course, he didn't do it all by himself. And what we talk about in this 6-week course is all the people, not just the singers and the acts, the performers who are out front, of course, but some of the people behind the scenes, besides Berry Gordy, the people who got the performers to perform as well as they could, the incredible songwriters, the teams, the producers, the arrangers, all the people who made Motown a very unique and special organization. And what was so important about Motown was when it took place, not just what happened, but we talk about literally the decade of the 1960s and how the music could not be separated from what was happening in our country then. In week 1, we talk about Berry Gordy. Berry Gordy was a 3rd-generation African-American entrepreneur who came from a long line of very hardworking, very ambitious, I guess we could call them type A folks, who really wanted to put his heart and soul into something of his creation. A lot of people don't know this, but Berry Gordy himself was a very good musician and an excellent songwriter who wrote many early hits for Motown and other labels. So that first week, we basically laid the groundwork of how the Motown label got started in Detroit. Detroit, it's also important to note that Detroit was where most of these great artists actually grew up. African-American singers whose families emigrated from places like Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana and Texas, and in many cases were first-generation Detroiters. So Berry Gordy had this amazing confluence of talent from which to draw. The Miracles, Motown showstoppers, and down at the bottom, of course, we see Smokey Robinson. Smokey Robinson, fortunately, is still with us. He still does some occasional gigs. Smokey Robinson was the most important man out front in front of a microphone in the history of Motown. He was what we call a triple threat. He could sing like a dream. He could write some of the most beautiful songs in American pop music. Bob Dylan called Smokey Robinson America's greatest poet. He was also a great record producer. And he organized records in the studio, tunes that he had written for groups like The Temptations and The Contours and the great singer Mary Wells. And we learn how Smokey Robinson's artistry basically laid the template for what was to come. There he is. The microphone was his paintbrush, and the recording studio was his palette. And it's really great now, more than 50 years after those terrific records were first cut, and we would thrill to them and sing along with them and dance to them, to hear it in a different perspective now. I think it's really special. Week 3, we talk about the great female singing groups. That, of course, was the Marvelettes, who were the first great female singing group. 4 young women from a little town called Inkster outside of Detroit who broke in and had a few hits early. And then, of course, Martha and the Vandellas, Martha Reeves, who was just a secretary at Motown when she was 19. But she was so on top of it that after Gordy hired her just to be a clerical secretary, within 3 weeks, she was running the office. And of course, we talk about the amazing run of Diana Ross and Florence Ballard and Mary Wilson, and the songs that they put out there that were just iconic, historical, timeless hits. Virtually every one of them written, arranged, and produced by 2 brothers, Holland Dozier and Holland, and their friend Lamont Dozier. Eddie and Brian Holland and Lamont Dozier, and what they created that lasts forever. Week 4, I'm sure some of you may have seen the wonderful musical that is starting on Broadway very soon, called Aint Too Proud to Beg. Some of you may have seen that in Berkeley. My class gets into a little bit more detail, I think, about the Temptations and some of the things they went through. And we talk a little bit about behind the scenes of this group. And nobody ever was cooler than the Temptations. But the 4 Tops were cool as cucumbers. They did not have the sexy, stylistic dance steps. They weren't super handsome. They weren't 5 great lead singers. They were 1 great lead singer, Levi Stubbs, second from the left, and his childhood buddies, who became proficient, slick, polished performers in the supper clubs all across America, opening for people like Billy Eckstine, and went on to superstardom right in the middle of the Motown decade. Week 5, and that's a wonderful picture of the late, great Mary Wells, whose hits were all written, arranged, and produced by Smokey Robinson, who had a very tough life, who was signed when she was 17, and when she turned 21, realized that the contract she had signed when she was a teenager was the worst thing she could have done. Tammi Terrell. How many people remember Tammi Terrell? We will never know how great she would have been because she was only 24 when she passed away, but we remember her incredible duets with Marvin Gaye. And of course, Gladys Knight, still going strong, from Atlanta, who grew up with that gospel DNA and got her cousins and her family members involved and created a singing group which has lasted 50 years and is still out there. Week 6, I combine, this is the final week of the class, and we talk about 2 of the iconic singer-songwriter performers, not just in the Motown pantheon, but in the history of American music. Marvin Gaye, divided soul, divided in many ways, personally and musically, had an amazing career before he died tragically at the hands of his dad. And of course, Stevie Wonder, the inner visionary. I feel like Stevie Wonder's life and career I've kind of grown up with it. He and I were born the same year, and he's just basically done everything in his career and continues to astonish. So that basically is the class. For those of you folks, those handful, I guess, who haven't been in any of my classes, they're a little bit different than your typical music appreciation, music history class for a couple reasons. I mean, I do show a lot of slides with photos and captions. I, of course, will play maybe 8 or 10 audio CDs of these tunes, sometimes in their entirety. Show the lyrics frequently, because I'm a big lyric guy. I think it's important to see the words, especially by people like Stevie Wonder and Smokey Robinson, the great lyricists. And I also will play selected archival video clips, usually from documentaries more so than YouTube. Ones that are maybe a little hard to find, but they're really great to see. And what I do different from most music classes is I'm a lifetime musician, and we have a piano in the classroom, and I play the piano and the guitar, and I'll have at least one, if not a couple of guests. And every class, I will demonstrate certain techniques and styles, maybe chord progressions and rhythms, but don't worry, it's not a music class. You don't have to play an instrument or want to learn anything about theory to get 100% out of this class. And then the second thing I'll do is I'll actually perform some of the tunes from this style. So I believe this class starts 3 weeks from today. I look forward to seeing many of you there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Pete. I have a feeling you will see many people there. Okay, moving on to somebody who also is no stranger to OLLI. She has brought a wonderful blend of art and history to our program for many years and spends part of her time out of the country and part of her time teaching elsewhere, so I'm always delighted when our schedules align and she can come back to OLLI at SSU, this time talking about Venice and the imagination. Please join me in welcoming Heidi Chrétien.
Good morning, and it feels so great to be back here. It's always such an emotional boost to see you people sitting out here listening to us talk. So, Pete, we move from the magic and the allure of Motown to a slightly different venue of Venice. Venice is clearly one of the most alluring and beautiful cities in the world. How many of you visited Venice? Oh, great. This will not be a travelogue. It's going to be Venice and the imagination. So, what is it that creates this magic and the allure of Venice? As you look at one of these, or many of these images up here, I didn't want to change them. I wanted you to listen to me instead. What is it that creates this sense of magic, of a city that seems to rise up like Venus on the half shell as it rises up through the waters of the lagoon? What is it that gives this quality of reflected images that flicker and change with the light? It's many things. It's the physicality of the city itself, but it's also the story that it tells of itself. The Venetians had something that they created, they cultivated, and they spread, which was the myth of Venice. And what was this myth? It was the myth that Venice was La Serenissima, the most serene place on earth. It was a place of peace, stability, prosperity, cosmopolitanism, but most of all, it was God's chosen place for his most pious people. Notice I'm saying his. But Venice herself was female. And this is part of that magic that is Venice. Venice has been likened to Venus, to the Virgin Mary, and all other female constructs that we can come up with. Not the ones that you will hear about in Douglas's class that cause war, etc., although the Venetians certainly went to war, But what we'll do in this class is look at all aspects of what went into creating this myth as God's given place on earth. I'm sure we can make some allusions that the Americans, when they founded their our only republic, were certainly looking to Venice as a role model. But the second part of the class, after we look at the governance, the art, primarily of the 14th through the 16th centuries, the golden age of Venice, Venice really began to cultivate this myth when it was less of an imperial power. In other words, as it began its physical decline, it boosted the story. And it is during this time that it truly captured the imagination of many writers, both of great literature, Shakespeare. How many of you had to read The Merchant of Venice in your high school English classes? All the way to the 20th and 21st century with the mysteries of Donna Leon. I know many of you read Donna Leon's mysteries with that intrepid philosophical detective known as Guido Brunetti, who ruminates about what's happening in Venice. How is Venice coping with the modern world? So every week I'd like to choose at least one piece of literature to explore. Did they get it right? Did they truly understand? Did Shakespeare truly understand how the Venetians operated when he told his tale of Shylock, the Jewish moneylender? How did he get it right about the Venetian nobleman who needed money to be able to woo the woman that he wanted to marry? We'll also be looking at how the myth changes in the 19th century. We probably all remember the story of Death in Venice, Thomas Mann's great epic of the plague and how it affects the city. And it becomes a new mythological construct of death in Venice. Why Venice? Why this beautiful place should be associated with death? And I like to explore this, especially with 20th century film, because there are many films that explore this, not just Death in Venice itself, the great Visconti film, but also Venice as a kind of site for rebirth. Many of you remember Katharine Hepburn as she discovers Venice. She didn't just discover Rome and toss coins in the fountain, but she also went to Venice and discovered love in her later years. The wonderful Italian film Bread and Tulips, of a disaffected housewife who is left at an autogrill on the autostrada and makes her way to Venice and finds love. What is this all about? So, in order to know that, come on Tuesday mornings at 9:30, and we'll talk about the myth of Venice and the imagination. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heidi. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce somebody who is new to the OLLI program, somebody who proposed a class that when she presented it to our curriculum committee, we all looked around and said, why haven't we done something like this sooner? I think this is a real treat and a welcome addition to our roster and something that will resonate with many of you. She is a Petalumen who I've learned frequents the same bakery that I do. We recently discovered this, and we're delighted to welcome her to OLLI. Please join me in bringing to the stage Susan Stewart.
Good morning. It's good to be here. I actually have been here before, about 10 years ago, teaching along with Heidi and some other people. And that was a time where I was a professor in the psych department and just got interested in old at about the age of 54. I had never thought about old, and it took me about 20 years to discover what a gold mine these golden years are. And so that's what the class is about. Now, I'm sure you're aware I just need to check this, yes, because I haven't done this in 10 years either. I want to be sure the right person's up there. I'm sure you're aware in many places in the world, to be old is considered a gift, and elders are revered, and they play a number of important roles in their communities, providing sage counsel in times of trouble and difficulty, guiding the young, and preserving important values and traditions. I'm sure you've noticed that in this culture, we are not particularly valued as we age. And although that's changing, we hear far less about the gifts of late life and much more about the things we need to fear. There have been about 60 years of research that have refuted the idea that old means losing everything and sliding into misery. The more current thinking, that is the last 60 years, is that many of what were once considered inevitable effects of age are actually the result of inactivity and attitude. And most of those can be prevented or offset by healthy practices like staying active, staying connected to the important people in our life, and finding what is most of value to us now and staying engaged with that. So we'll be using some imagery and poetry. Each week we'll be looking at a couple of positive trends in late life development. There'll be a folk tale each week that illustrates some of these gifts of later life, the ways that they enhance our own well-being and health, but also how they contribute to the community. We'll also have examples from film and hopefully from your and my and others' experience to validate these gifts of later life, and snippets of research that have confirmed that many of the qualities that we'll be talking about actually do ripen in later life. So some of the things we're going to be looking at is the growth of the coming home to the self. Anne Lamott has written, "Age has given me what I was looking for all my life. It has given me me." So at the same time, we're coming into a more solid sense of self and a freer sense of self. When I walked in today, one of the ambassadors asked one of the students coming in, "Have you been behaving yourself?" And she said, "I have no interest in behaving myself anymore." So we come home to the self, but we also get over ourselves. There's a growing sense as we age of being part of something timeless and bigger than our own ego and little self. Some call it the bundle or the web of life. The Celts saw it as a thread that ran through all of life and connected us to everything. And there is a term called gerotranscendence that describes this move away from the little self into kinship with other people and generations and species. We also grow more content as we age, and there's a great deal of research suggesting that older people are happier than younger adults, and midlife adults in particular. And it's a contentment that is not dependent on outer circumstance, but on inner resources. We develop what's called emotional mastery. We become less reactive to negative stimuli. The aging brain actually calms down and allows us to ride those ebbs and flows of life with greater equanimity and with humor. We become, in a sense, masters and mistresses of the half-full glass. The only exception to contentment in later life is injustice. And there's tradition in cultures that the elder is the one who is willing to stand up and speak, say the unpopular thing, or do the necessarily fierce act on behalf of the greater good. We also discover as we age that we don't lose young. And a lot of the qualities associated with young and very young people and children, like the ability to savor a simple moment, like shopping for produce, or to enjoy nature, or to simply be and not be driven to do, return. So we become, as older people, I think, citizens of all the seasons of life, with access to all the selves we've been and the self we are now. One of the, I don't want to call it a myth because I'm fond of myths, so one of the erroneous ideas in this view of age as decline is that we lose our memories and then our minds. Most of the things we fear about age actually are not the norm. And there is a flood of memories. Many of you maybe have noticed this, especially long ago memories from childhood and adolescence and early adulthood. They come in dreams, they come when we smell a certain thing or an anniversary of an event comes up. And that's a very crucial part of late life development. Early on in gerontology, it was actually geriatrics. The illnesses of age is where it started. That's one of the origins of this downhill slide idea. And there was an understanding of old people is that they sat around doing nothing and remembering the old days and losing touch with reality. Robert Butler, who was the fairy godfather of gerontology, said, wait, there's something very important going on in the remembering of our early lives. It's called the Life Review, and we are given a chance to savor again the joys we've experienced and also come to terms with unfinished business. The purpose of the Life Review is both to prepare us to die without regret, but also to enliven our life while we are still alive and be able to bless all the selves we've been and to die at peace, and to recognize we still have a great deal to offer younger generations, which is the task of the elder. So I hope you'll join me on Tuesday afternoons to talk more about the surprising gifts.
Well, as somebody who had a rather significant birthday last year that I confess to most of you, which allows me to take OLLI classes, I find myself in the throes of middle-aged angst, and what you're talking about doesn't sound half bad. Okay, moving on to somebody who many of you have been asking, when is he coming back? Well, he's back. He is back with a class based on some newer research of his, which I'm excited to hear more about. But what I really love, more than the content and the instructor himself, is the title of this class, because it's how I wake up most mornings. My brain hurts. Critical thinking, decision-making, and ethics in the 21st century. How many of you have taken a class from Eric Williams? Fantastic. So he needs very little introduction, but for those who are in for a treat for the first time, I give you Eric Williams.
I don't have anything. Oh, you made me one. That was very nice of you. Thank you. I actually said I just wanted to come up here and talk because that's my preferred way. This is a class that's going to be a little different. I've done a couple classes on the Supreme Court. We've done some work in the criminal justice field. This is a class that comes from a whole different part of my world. About 10 years ago, I was invited down to a correctional management institute. It's an institute that does training for prisons and parole and probation people. And they had me come down on my original dissertation, which was on rural prison towns. And I would go down there and I would talk to prison wardens about being better community leaders. And about 3 years in, the director of the program, who used to run the Texas prison system, said, "Hey, do you know anything about critical thinking?" And I said, I know a little bit about it. And he said, "Well, how would you like to create a class for us on critical thinking?" And I thought he was crazy, and I didn't think I had any expertise in doing it, but I said, he was willing to pay me some money, so I said, okay. And so what happened was, over the course of the next year, we put together a week-long program that we've now given 16 times. It's a week-long program, and we bring people in from all over the country, and we do critical thinking, decision-making, ethics, and emotional intelligence for correctional leaders. And as time has gone on, it's been very interesting. I've been asked to speak in various prison systems. I've now seen over 200 prisons in America and elsewhere, and luckily they've let me out of every one of them. But I thought it would be really interesting to take what I do in that class and try to teach it to an audience that wasn't specifically interested in criminal justice. And so what we're going to do is we're going to focus on really how psychology has changed much of how we view human behavior in the last 50 years. And a lot of really interesting research has come out of a group of people called behavioral economists. And these people have really kind of rewritten the way that we think about our decision making. And so what I wanted to do was take this class that I had created for a different audience and bring it to you. And so it's going to be a fun class. I gave a short talk at the Glazier Center that sort of introduced the topic back in October, I think it was. And I'm going to grow it from there and really give you the kind of the full program that I give to these correctional leaders, but focus much more on your day-to-day life. So if you're not interested in criminal justice, it's fine. It's much more about decision-making and really what makes us make certain decisions and what makes us tick. And so I thought it'd be really fun for everybody to be introduced to that. So that will be the class, and I'll see you on Wednesday mornings.
Thank you, Eric. Okay, now for someone who needs very little introduction, again, to many of you. He is the chair of our advisory board. He's on our curriculum committee. He has been a staple of this program for many years. He's also taught for other OLLI programs around the Bay Area, but I'm delighted to say has decided to invest a little more time and energy in this one, perhaps, than the others, making this his home base. I used to say he could teach the phone book or the Sears and Roebuck catalog, but that's getting really old. So I'm just going to say we like him a lot. Please join me in welcoming Mick Chandler.
Thank you. Well, it's good to be back, and I'm delighted to unveil a new course that I'll be debuting here in 3 weeks called The American Revolution, an English Perspective. The genesis of the course came from a series of reflections that I had when I taught a course here a few years ago called The Founding Fathers. And it dealt with the same era, the founding period of 1763 to say 1815 or so, but it emphasized our side of the story, what Americans thought about this seminal period in world history, not just American history. And it occurred to me that probably what most Americans know about the American Revolution comes from the writings of Thomas Jefferson, the reflections of George Washington, Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, and the figures that won the war. And it gives you an interesting perspective, but an incomplete one. We really can't understand an event as complicated as a major revolutionary epoch without looking at the other side, the English side of the story, and we're going to see that that's a very complex picture. The war in England was a bitterly divisive national experience for the British people. Many historians have referred to the Revolutionary War as England's Vietnam, which will dovetail very nicely, I think, with Les Adler's class on our own Vietnam experience of the 1960s that he will be teaching on Thursdays here. So I'd like to give you briefly now a little overview of what we'll be attempting to accomplish in the class, the American Revolution, an English Perspective. Week 1 will deal with the events leading up to the revolution. The lecture will be entitled The Making of a Revolution, and we're going to try to understand how a relatively peaceful, harmonious empire, the British Empire, in the year 1763 suddenly became a brutal, violent cauldron of venomous hatreds and war crimes and atrocities and a bloodletting on an amazing scale. In just 12 short years, we went from peace to war in just a little over a decade. How did that change take place in such a compact period of time? It's stunning to me to see how a prosperous ship of state can founder and sink in such short order. Kind of a cautionary tale, perhaps, maybe for our own times. Week 2 will be looking at the villain of the story, at least the villain from the American point of view, and we'll be looking at the life of King George III, who, if you read Thomas Jefferson's great work, The Declaration of Independence, and if you care to go beyond the first 2 or 3 paragraphs, which we all here on the 4th of July and rightfully celebrate, but if we go beyond the feel-good parts of the Declaration, we see about a 2 or 3 page long screed against this man, who is depicted as essentially an 18th century version of Hitler in the Declaration of Independence. And we're going to see that that's a very one-sided piece of propaganda that doesn't really reflect the nature of George III. One historian that I have been reading said that George III's greatest fault was lack of imagination and the fact that he was boring. Well, I hope to be able to make an interesting lecture out of a boring man, but we'll see. We'll see that he is not necessarily the character that we may have thought he was when we were children and took our mandatory high school classes in U.S. history and basically accepted the Jeffersonian view of George III. We'll see that there were many, many sides to this man, and he wasn't all bad. Week 3, we'll be discussing a figure that probably most of us have never even heard of. Thomas Hutchinson was the governor of Massachusetts during the last years before the outbreak of violence in 1774 and 1775, which triggered the Revolution and the independence movement. He's the last royal governor of Massachusetts, and he's a very tragic figure, and I think he's illustrative of the bitter nature of this period for many, many people. Thomas Hutchinson was a 4th-generation American. He was born in Massachusetts, as were his ancestors. He was very proud to be an inhabitant of the Bay Colony. He loved his country as he would have seen it, but he was also a royal appointee to serve at the king's pleasure to implement British imperial policy. And he took his oath of office to King George and Parliament very, very seriously. And he becomes a martyr, really, to his loyalty to the crown. He's an American, but he remains loyal to the mother country. He sees himself as both a citizen of Massachusetts and a citizen of the British Empire. How do you reconcile those two tugging, antithetical impulses in one human soul during a time of crisis? And we'll use him as exemplary of what many, thousands and thousands of Americans experienced during the Revolution. A somewhat embarrassing fact to bring out on the 4th of July, and that is that many Americans did not support the Patriot movement. Many Americans were not at all interested in independence. They felt very contented with their status within the British Empire and did not want to leave. These were the people called the Loyalists or the Tories. That was the derogatory term put on to these people. But they felt they were just obeying the law and adhering to their promises. So that will be the subject matter for week 3. Week 4 will be following up on that theme by looking at a character that we all know a great deal about, Benjamin Franklin, depicted here along with his son, William. The title of this lecture is Civil War Within the Franklin Household, family. And it deals with the fact that while Benjamin becomes one of the foremost revolutionary heroes that we all know and love, but his son, who's the royal governor of New Jersey, decides to remain loyal to the British Empire and to uphold his office, his obligatory oaths that were involved in carrying out his official duties as the royal governor of the colony of New Jersey. It creates a breach between the two that divides the family and will result in the fact that the two really hardly ever speak to each other again for the rest of their lives. And there's something very tragic and poignant about this story. If any of you have ever seen the rather famous painting of Benjamin Franklin flying his kite in his electricity experiments, there's always a little boy standing right beside him, a 12-year-old boy. That's William. The two were as close as father and son could be, and yet revolution divides them and will drive them apart to the point where they can no longer tolerate each other. And that's the sad part of civil wars. And I'm going to emphasize that the American Revolution was most definitely a civil war. And it was a civil war on a big scale within the British Empire, but on a local level and even on a family level, as the case of the Franklins will illustrate. Week 5, we'll be looking at the English Parliament and how the decisions that they made in the 12 years leading up to the outbreak of violence at Lexington and Concord led to a dissolution of this once prosperous and seemingly undivided empire. We'll look at Parliament from two standpoints. Number one, the establishment figures in Parliament who supported the king and his cabinet in their desire to coerce America back into submission and back into the fold of the English Empire. But we'll also see that there were many opposition figures in Parliament who were bitterly opposed to the war and who made no secret of their sometimes violent opposition to the king and his cabinet's war policies. It was very much like the American experience in Vietnam, I think, by the late 1960s, when you had peace candidates like Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy battling against the establishment figures that were carrying on the war. Here we see the two ends of the spectrum in British Parliament. On the left, we see Lord George Germain, a figure that was the architect, you could say, really, of English policy in attempting to subdue America militarily. And then his arch opponent on the far right, Edmund Burke, one of the most famous parliamentarians of the 18th century, who was extremely sympathetic to the American position and fought as hard as he could against king and cabinet and the majority in Parliament to bring the war to a close and to negotiate a peaceful settlement between the colonists and the mother country, one that would bring them back together in some way, shape, or form. The last week of the course is one that I find utterly fascinating. It's called Peaceful Warriors, an oxymoron, to be sure, but it deals with the fact that the British military leadership that was given the task of subduing the rebels in America, the vast majority of them were extremely dubious about their prospects of success, and most of them, like the figures depicted here, a pair of brothers, William Howe on the left, who is the commander of the ground forces of the British Army in North America during the early days of the Revolution, and his brother Richard on the right, who is the commander of the naval forces that Britain brought to bear in attempting to subdue the American rebels. Both of these men had no illusions that this war could be a success. They were absolutely convinced that it was a futile and folly measure on the part of Parliament to insist on military coercion, and they did as much as humanly possible, given their positions as British military leaders, to bring the war to a negotiated halt. And of course, they failed. But we're going to see that so many of the British military leaders, the figures that we remember hearing about, at least in terms of their names, Lord Cornwallis and Thomas Gage, on, John Burgoyne, virtually all of them felt that this was not likely to end well for Great Britain. The country was too large to subdue by military force. By 18th century standards, the English sent a great army to America, 40,000 troops, but that was not nearly enough to subdue a country that was 1,800 miles long and probably, effectively speaking, 100 or 200 miles wide in from the Atlantic coast. Les will no doubt talk to you about in Vietnam when we had, 570,000 troops in a country much smaller than America, combined with all the air power and modern technology that the U.S. military could bring to bear, and they were unable to subdue a motivated enemy. How could 40,000 British troops possibly bring this war to a successful conclusion for England? Virtually impossible in the minds of most British military leaders. So we're going to see that it's a complicated story, but it's one that I believe necessary for us to understand if we're going to truly grasp the full significance of the American Revolution. And I hope that you'll join me on Wednesdays in the afternoon, and I'm looking forward to this topic. It's one that I've been thinking about for years, and now I'm happy to be able to share my thoughts with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mick. Okay, so when I asked how many of you were here in the beginning, this is one hand that went up. Les Adler was a pivotal figure in getting this program off the ground and largely responsible for its establishment back in 2001. He has been a pleasure to work with in my 6-year, almost tenure here. He stepped away from teaching for a while, and I coerced him, I'd like to think, into coming back. And he's got a wonderful class on something that I know we all would like to hear more about, and I'm really happy that he's back on the roster, Les Adler.
Thank you, Karyn, and welcome and good morning. It's lovely to be up here again. I was here originally 18 years ago when we started this program, and I'm glad to see that none of you have aged at all in the process. This is a class which has a full title of the Vietnam War, a 50-year perspective on a 30-year war. And just out of curiosity, how many of you think that the current political moment we're in is the most divisive period you've lived through in your life? A few of you feel that way. Well, we have to talk. Because I believe, and I will be arguing in the class, that 50 years ago and around that period of time, the nation was torn apart in ways which make today's politics seem relatively tame so far. Something happened to that experience in the ensuing years. I was very interested in what Mick was saying, because evidently the British got over their loss here. They got over their Vietnam. I'm not sure we have. And part of the nature of the course will be looking at what happened to it in our memories. Where did it go? We don't talk about it very much. It somehow was not solved to some degree, so it remained repressed. And what happens with things that get repressed in a personal psyche or a national psyche? Well, they go underground and appear in strange ways. All of us, no matter who we were at that period of our lives, where we lived, what our social, economic, or political orientations were shaped by that war. It affected us, whatever side of the spectrum you were on about the war. We were affected by it. It did things to us and which I believe shaped our future and also fractured our future in ways that we're just coming now to understand. So there's a wall in Washington that most of you have probably seen. How many of you have been to the Vietnam Memorial there? Virtually everybody in the room. And if you go there, you find that this wall that Maya Lin designed and built runs across a valley. It's long, it's dark, and it's, for many people, a healing place. You go there and you watch, as we did recently, my wife and I, and people are still going, Vietnam veterans, their children, their grandchildren, and they're going and they're touching the name on the wall, or they're touching, or they're doing a rubbing, or they're looking through a book to see where their relative or their friend or somebody they knew is memorialized there. So it serves a healing purpose. But the other thing that struck me, and that I think may strike all of you when you really think about it, is what Maya Lin intuited that is so brilliant is that it is a wall. How interesting in our current political reality that this basic symbol that she put there to represent what happened in that experience is a wall. It divides our history. It divides our country. It stands for a division, and it is a dark wall. It is not like the white marble temples around it in the National Mall. There are no upward pillars. There's no upward thrust to it. It runs down a valley and then up the other side, sort of ends in an undetermined fashion. It didn't get finished. The war never got finished for us. And that's really a large part of what the class will be looking at, or the undercurrent, the undermeaning of the class. All of us, I think, carry a whole variety of memories implanted in us about Vietnam. The dominoes, the whole domino theory, which people use to argue we had to go in and stop the aggression, or the dominoes would all fall throughout Southeast Asia and next they'd be in San Diego. Well, the dominoes didn't fall, but that image was implanted. Or how about the light at the end of the tunnel? The great light at the end of the tunnel that all of our presidents and all of our leaders kept seeing turned out in reality to be the locomotive of history coming directly at us and rolling over us. Another iconic image, the helicopters rescuing people from the embassy in Saigon before it fell, taking out refugees, taking out Americans, the last flights, kind of a national humiliation. We don't think about that very much. We don't like to think about that. The other statue that's in the mall related to Vietnam is of 3 American GIs standing kind of in a forest, looking bewildered or overwhelmed by what they've been through. Those are the kinds of things we carry. We're not carrying images like we did of World War II, where the Marines holding the flag up on Iwo Jima, or thinking about the Civil War as a place where we ended slavery, we completed the task, or an important task for us. Vietnam didn't have that kind of catharsis. We've never had that kind of catharsis. And I would argue it's left us in a very vulnerable place as a nation. So this is today's New York Times, March the 25th, 1969, 50 years ago. And although you can't read the wording in it, it describes continuing battles in all the four tactical zones of Vietnam, going on very actively. Now, this is March of 1969. We have a new president who's just taken office, Richard Nixon, who took over because of many reasons, but one of which is he had a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. That's what he kept saying. Well, he's been in office for 3 months, and what it turns out is that though he hasn't started bombing again in North Vietnam, we have troops moving toward the Laotian border and toward Cambodia. Critics of the war were already saying, he looks like he's going to broaden the war. This war, which has gone on for 24 years already, though most of us never really understood how deeply buried in our history the beginnings of this war were, this war is going to go on for another 6 years from that point. It is a war that has already...
For it seems now more certain...
Let me back up one space. Where were we? Okay, I got it.
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.
That was Uncle Walter, and that was on February 13th, 1968, just a year before the article that I put up there. It was a war that had already destroyed, and it was in the process of destroying 2 presidencies. It had already just about forced Lyndon Johnson out. You remember the famous David Levine caricature of Johnson pointing to a scar on his stomach that just happens to look like Vietnam. He had had an operation, and like Johnson was showing it off to the press. And of course, Richard Nixon leaving office. 2 presidencies which were destroyed by this war. Nixon's was yet to be destroyed, but the war was, as much as anything, the reason that he was destroyed, his presidency was destroyed. And that's the way it was, or that's the way it is, as Uncle Walter used to say, ending his news broadcasts. The whole world was watching the riots at the Chicago Convention, was watching the fighting in the streets, was watching the country come apart at the seams. Remember that? We're not there yet in our particular political world. But it was a place where the country seemed to be in an unsolvable position. We saw no way out. A new president had come in, and so far things were only getting worse, getting increasingly broadened as the war was. Within a very short period of time, we had marches. Here are young demonstrators on one side, very young, facing very young military on the other, a face-off in America that remained part of our consciousness, and only became worse the following year when the guns actually got used at Kent State and at other universities, and students were killed. So the country was in the midst of turmoil, tumultuous time. So the course is really about questions: why were we there? What got us into this? When did it start? Why did we stay there? Who were the decision makers? What caused us to not take other choices? Why did we go this route? And were there turning points where somebody could have said, no, let's don't go down that path? The debates were there. I'm not sure our military was as sure that this was an unwinnable war as perhaps the British generals were. We thought, our military leaders thought they could win. They didn't learn certain lessons from history, and they had a very different mindset. And we had a different mindset as a nation. America doesn't lose wars, according to Lyndon Johnson. So the course will be looking at a lot of questions as we go along. We'll look through the whole 30 years of the war, what led to it, and then we will also be looking and asking the question as the course goes on, what did it do to us? Does the current political situation we're in have any resonance in what the war did or what the war left unresolved? Is our position today somewhat related to all that went on, all that was repressed, and who we are as a nation? So I hope you'll join me on Thursdays in the morning for a trip down memory lane and see if our long-term memories still are very active. Thank you.
Okay, so I know that there are a handful of you out there who are saying, well, that was all great, but where's the science? We have that. We have saved for last our, oddly, single science class this term, but I think it's one that, given where we're situated in the world, has particular meaning to a lot of us. Natalie is new to OLLI, and am I allowed to say your connection to Sonoma State or not? So when I was looking for more science instructors, I thought, maybe I'll contact the Dean of Science and Technology at Sonoma State University, Lynn Stauffer. Maybe she'll know of somebody. So she said, I'll make sure to get the word out to my faculty and to my community. And a couple of weeks later, I got a proposal from somebody named Natalie Stauffer Olson. And I thought, well, that's a coincidence. And it turns out not to be such a coincidence, but I had heard of Natalie from her mother for a while, another fellow Petaluman. All roads lead to Petaluma, turns out. And she came and presented to the committee about this idea of water in the West. And we all said, again, why have we not had a class like this sooner? So I'm always delighted to welcome new young members to our faculty, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Natalie Stauffer Olson.
All right, thank you so much, Karyn, and thanks everyone for being here this morning. So I'm going to start this science class by asking everyone to close your eyes. We just learned a couple different lectures about wars, and I don't know about you, but I'm like needing to just relax a bit. So why don't you imagine being next to a still lake, a beautiful body of water. Maybe it's Lake Tahoe, maybe it's Crater Lake, maybe it's a different one, but imagine just being next to water. And what does that feel like for you? Maybe you can hear some of the waves just barely lapping the sides of the ocean of the lake. And maybe there's a bird or two or 10 or 20 that come and they drink some water and bathe a bit in the lake. And you can notice that the lake is so clear. Maybe there's some fish. And it's just very, very peaceful. And so that's something, you can open your eyes now, but that's something that I love about water. And yes, my background is in science. I hold a PhD in freshwater ecology, and that will be one of the lenses that we'll use to explore this really amazing element. But I'm also going to hopefully encourage folks to really think about our relationship with water. We are so intimately involved with water on personal, spiritual, cultural, political levels, and there's really a lot to explore there. But despite this really intimate and really complex relationship, a lot of folks that I interact with in my daily life don't know really anything about water, where it comes from, what it feels like to not have it. I recently was in Tanzania and was really humbled to see what life is like when people don't have access to water that they can just turn on with their faucets. It really dictates their entire life and culture. And so You know, the importance of water really cannot be overstated. Maybe I'm a little bit biased here. But again, it's something that is inside of us. It's something that culturally, civilization evolved next to water. Life itself evolved within water. And so it's really, really important. And, you know, not only is there this human need, you know, domestic uses, agricultural uses, but there's non-human need as well. So freshwater diversity is pretty, it's one of the most threatened group of organisms on the planet. And it has the most diversity per square unit of area. So even more lakes and rivers and streams are even more diverse per unit area than rainforests or coral reefs. And so, you know, they're very diverse, and we also get so many food resources from these healthy systems as well. Healthy oceans, I've heard, are from healthy rivers. You can't have a healthy coastal system unless you have healthy rivers that are not washing a ton of trash and waste into the coast. And then this is just kind of a personal look at things. And then when you can really scale back, when you can see our planet from space, it's a blue planet. It's not actually planet Earth, it's planet water. It's 70% covered in water. And so it's just so important. And so in that light, here's a quick roadmap. I'm not going to go into details about what we're going to look at each week, but really we're going to start looking at what our present connection is to water, and it's going to be locally emphasized. I am from Petaluma. I work for a nonprofit here in Northern California, and I've been working in Northern California with these water issues for my entire career. So we'll definitely focus on more local issues, but then we'll also look a bit at some different topics and projects that are going on in Oregon and Washington. But, you know, in addition to just sharing this information, I really want folks to be able to come away from the course having the knowledge so they can make some informed decisions when it comes to projects or choices here in our community that can be directly impacting us. So it's really kind of a civil and civic flair as well. I also hope to just catalyze the awe and inspiration that I feel associated with water for my students, and hopefully maybe plant some seeds for action that Susan referenced can be really a player in some parts of our life. And so then in week 2, we're just going to go a bit into freshwater ecology basics. And so because I am a scientist, this is really the lens that I usually look through. And so we're going to just look at the basics so that when we talk about ecological processes and we talk about current issues and we talk about what things happened in the past and what can happen in the future, we know a bit about the basics of that and why those function the way they do. And then we'll go into the historical ecology, and I really want students to be able to imagine what this system looked like when we weren't damming and confining all of our waterways and putting them under roads. But really, the natural processes were able to work with themselves and provide so much abundance to this state and to this area. So I want to go in, which is really the root of the wine industry here and of people being here. So I want to go into that a bit. And then we'll look into how we can try to come into right relation with water again. We'll talk about some restoration practices that are used and really thinking about how we can make things better for the future so that our kids and grandkids can have healthy water into the future. And I started this off with a little bit of a short meditation, encouraging us to think about our relationship to water, and that's going to be consistent focus throughout the class. So in all 6 weeks, we'll have some sort of little homework assignment where I will encourage folks to go out and really contemplate and untangle their relationship with water. And we'll get a bit into poetry, which is my last slide, which, water has inspired so much beautiful art and so much beautiful poetry. And I might argue with Heidi that one of the big draws, for instance, of Venice is that it is on water. And it photographs beautifully, and people can move around on water. And that's novel, but that's also really not novel. That's very human, and that's very consistent throughout the entire world. So maybe in a little lens. And as I was listening to the other lectures, there was so many things like, water's related to that, water's related to that, because there's so many social justice and environmental justice kind of relationships, like a lot of wars, for instance, and I won't go into the specifics because I don't know the details, but many times when communities, when there's a water project and local communities are no longer able to have shallow groundwater wells, that's a really big displacer of people from the land, which can cause all sorts of different civil issues and wars as well. So there's my cue, my plug for learning about water. I hope to see you all on Thursday afternoons from 1 till 3. This is just a little tiny taste of what we'll be delving into, and I'm really excited to share a bit with my community. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. So I think you'll see we have a terrific lineup for the spring. I just want to make one quick announcement that I made in the winter at our course preview, but for those of you who might not have been here, I want to let you know what the next little bit looks like in terms of geography for our program. We will be in this spring in the Cooperage on this campus, which many of you know as our primary lecture hall on this campus. After this spring, we will not be in the Cooperage for a while because the largest, oldest building on this campus is being remodeled. And in the context of that, we are losing 29 classrooms from that building, which is causing a domino effect to a lot of programs on the campus. So this will be our last term in the Cooperage for a while. Our summer programming, which you'll find out about soon, will be here in person theater. And then starting in the fall of this year, we will be 1.5 miles down the road at Sonoma Mountain Village. There have been flyers in the classroom about that shift, and I'm happy to answer any other questions. But as a pop quiz, what are the 2 best things about Sonoma Mountain Village that I expressed? Free parking, number 1, and number 2? The bar, right. So it's not all bad. So I look forward to seeing you here on campus this spring, here in this room over the summer, and down the road in the fall. Thank you all for coming.